So welcome back. Today we're going to pick up again building on what we've been talking about. So again, we're starting with a job analysis, that core building block of personnel psychology. And we're using that to determine many factors about what a job entails, including how we measure performance. So we've really focused on both how we measure performance for organizational decision making and developmental reasons. We've talked about performance management, and we've talked about the specific aspects or models that are out there for how to measure all of performance in a meaningful way. And when we were talking about that, we were talking about the creation of performance criteria, individual measures of performance, which result in a performance criterion, the overall criterion of performance. Think of that as the kind of summative or single-dimensional measure of performance. We're now going to talk about using that job analysis, which then gave us information on how to measure performance. Now that we've measured performance, we can use the measurement of performance to try to determine predictors of that performance. In other words, things that we can measure in people that don't have the job yet to try to predict how well they'll do in the job. So we're going to talk about predictors, and this focus of this lecture is mainly going to be on the different methods or types of predictors we can use when we're talking about selection. So again, the process of selection is the idea that we're going to be bringing potential job applicants, people that want to have a job in an organization, they're applying for a job, and what kind of tests or measures can we give to them that are highly related to actual performance in the job. So all of you should be familiar with at least a part of this process. When you applied to come to college, you had to take either the ACT or the SAT test. You had to apply to the university. There may have been an interview. There may have been a short statement of purpose. And these were used along with your high school GPA transcripts to try to predict how well you do at college. And most universities have some basically minimum bars that they expect to see in both high school GPA and ACT or SAT performance, because those have been found to be related to future performance, your grade point average here at college. So those are predictors. The ACT and the SAT are a predictor. Your previous performance, your high school GPA, is a predictor. And also if you had to do like a personal statement or a statement of purpose, they would grade that and then give it a rating, again, as a predictor of future performance. So the role of predictors, when we're trying to select people for workplace settings, we're trying to select people for specific jobs, we do not have access to their actual performance. In other words, they haven't gotten the job yet. We don't have them on the job for months where we can measure performance. So we have to use predictors as substitutes for that performance. And the way we do this is we try to find predictive tests, predictive ways of measuring a person's personality, their knowledge, skills, and ability, again, often drawn from a job analysis, that are also highly related to real-world performance once someone is actually on the job. So predictors would be unnecessary if we actually knew which applicants would be good performers. So outside of predictors, if you have 10 job openings and only 10 people apply and you hire all 10, then in about 6 months, you'll know which ones are good performers and which ones are poor performers. The problem is that 6 months of some of those people underperforming, and that is costing an organization a lot of money. So if an organization can come up with a selection system where more than the people that they need to hire are actually applying, they can provide these predicting tests to that whole group to try to figure out which of these employees, which of these potential employees will be top performers. So predictors are being used to forecast criteria since we don't actually have criterion data yet. So we're using individual predictors, which are going to be matched with individual criteria of performance, in order to try to predict overall performance because we don't have data on overall performance yet. So a lot of the rest of this module of the lecture is going to be focused on the classification of tests, basically the different types of tests that we can give as predictors when we're trying to select people for a job. And again, the end of the day goal here is to predict who is going to perform well. So a test is a systematic procedure for observing behavior and describing it with the aids of numerical scales and fixed categories. So anytime we talk about a test, the definition of a test is that it's systematic. And systematic is important both for perceptions of justice reasons, for accuracy reasons, and also for legal reasons. So any selection test should be administered and should be the same process and the same items to anyone applying to the job, regardless of their status as far as their gender, their age, their ethnicity. The purpose of the test is to observe behavior, and sometimes that might be direct. A test can be actually having a set of raters watch someone's job behavior. However, a lot of times that behavior that's being observed is basically self-report behavior, so the person actually being measured will provide information about that behavior, or it may be behavior such as performance on knowledge items, performance on math problems. And finally, there needs to be a component of that test that provides a numerical scale or fixed category. So fixed categories can, for example, be meets expectations with reservations, does not meet expectations. In other words, 3 categories. The meets expectations, these are people you should consider hiring. Meets expectations with reservations, you may want to hire these people, but there's some issues. And finally, does not meet expectations, you shouldn't hire these people. Or simply a numerical scale. So on a typical test in a class, it's often a 100-point test with 90 and above being an A. So that's both a numerical scale and a fixed category. So systematic again means we're administering it the same way across people, and tests are basically synonymous with predictors. When we're talking about predictors, we're often talking about tests. Now, where you can actually get these tests, one of the resources is the Mental Measure Yearbook, and there's quite a few other publications that basically just provide information on where to get tests. Some tests are widely available for free on the internet. Some tests are available and have been published as part of published research studies, and yet other tests, especially more famous tests or tests that are more well known in IO psychology, are actually owned by some companies. So, for example, a lot of personality tests are actually owned by either the university that created them or a private organization that created them, and they charge people to use them. So, we're going to talk about how to classify tests. Tests, again, this is kind of the criteria to basically describe tests. And there's 3 broad categories that almost all tests can be defined by. Whether they're a speed or power test, whether they're done individually or in groups, and whether they're a pen and paper or performance test. So pretty much any predictor will be one or the other on each of these 3 dimensions. So the ACT, for instance, is a power test. What a power test is a test that you're given typically enough time to be able to answer all the questions. It's a group test, so you can take the SAT in a large group of people, everyone taking it together. You don't need individual raters or individual judges working one-on-one with the person taking the test. And finally, it's a pen and paper test. In this case, the pen and paper means that, again, and this also can refer to online, but again, it involves the person taking the test providing the response options that are then going to be converted into that numerical scale. Now, as we talk about each one of these, we'll also talk about how some tests differ from that pattern. So first we have speed versus power. A speed test involves relatively easy items with a very short time limit, and the goal is that you complete as many items as possible before the time expires. So the idea here is that you're going to measure 2 things with a speed test. You're going to measure number of items completed, and you're going to measure number of errors. Generally speaking, a speed test will always have more items on it than it is possible for anyone to complete in the time given. So a speed test might be 100 math problems, but you only have 1 minute to complete them. Almost no one is going to be able to do all 100, even if they're very simple problems. So then you simply determine how many did you actually answer and how many did you get right. And that's your score. A typing test is a speed test. You're given a large bulk of text and told to type out as much as you can in a minute or 5 minutes. And again, you'll be given more text than you could actually get typed in that time. And the measurement here is the number of words typed per minute, and again, the accuracy. Power tests tend to be, the items are going to be more difficult, but there's no fixed time limit. Now that's a little disingenuous, which meaning it's not quite accurate. A lot of times there will be a time limit, like the GRE, Graduate Record Exam, that you take as a predictor for graduate school success, usually has a 3-hour time limit. But what we mean by a no fixed time limit really is that the time limit that's assigned is generally longer than what most people will need to be able to answer the questions. So a lot of tests that you have in classes are power tests. You're given an hour and 15 minutes to complete 50 items. And the vast majority of students will get that done in about half of that time. Some of them might take near the full time, but generally speaking, in my own experience included, when there's someone left at the very end, they've already answered all the questions. They're now just going back and forth over ones that they're not sure about. So the test taker is expected to complete all items. Speed tests are very good if what you're wanting to measure is a job that involves making quick decisions and quick, accurate decisions. If that's a part of the job performance, then a speed test is appropriate. Power tests are more appropriate if just general knowledge is what you're trying to measure. You're wanting to see how do people do when they're given the time to think about a problem. So speed versus power, we have a couple of examples on this slide. The first one here is we're looking at instructions. Place an X in the line between each pair of items that are exactly the same. Do as many as you can. So again, this is an example of 5, and you're comparing the first example to the left to the second example on the right. So Becky Huber versus Becky Huber. One of them, there's 2 Ks. You would note that there was an error on that one. But you would go through a whole list. And again, this might be a very good test for someone whose job is being a copy editor, finding small mistakes in text. By comparison, a power test is going to be more about detailed and more difficult questions that would be hard to complete very, very quickly. Focused is the opposite of scattered, concerned, helpful, or gracious. In this case, it's scattered. So again, these would be, you're wanting to just get the person's general vocabulary or mathematical knowledge. Number 4, which number completes the series? 2, 4, 8, 4, 8, 16, 8. This is again showing, are you good at pattern recognition? Now again, any of these tests need to be somewhat related to the type of job you're giving them for. So individual versus group tests. What defines an individual test is it's generally administered one person at a time, and usually involves there being an expert or a subject matter expert or a consultant that has to be involved in the testing. So it tends to be very costly in time and money. You can only bring one person at a time, and you're having to pay the person that's giving the test. An example of this is the Wechsler Intelligence Test. It is not a test that's delivered in mass groups. It involves someone that's actually been trained in how to administer the intelligence test to take someone through a process of various types of problems. And these tests generally are more accurate, but also more costly. A group test simply means that multiple applicants can be tested at the same time, either electronically or physically. So if you can bring a bunch of people in at once and test them equally without having to have direct interaction with each person, with a rater or a trainer or someone that knows how to do the test, that's a group test. They tend to be much more cost effective. And finally, paper or pencil versus performance. So paper and pencil or online paper and pencil tests, many different formats. They can be essay, multiple choice, true or false, short answer. Most cognitive ability tests are in this format, and many are now computerized. Example, the GRE, the SAT, the ACT. And they often typically offer very quick and accurate scoring. A performance test, by comparison, requires actual manipulation of the object or piece of equipment. And often, performance tests are also individual tests. So when you go in to get your driver's license, you take a test, basically multiple choice test on the rules of the road. That's a paper and pencil test, and that can be administered to a whole group at once. 20 people could all be there taking the same test at the same time, and basically one person can try to just overlook to make sure no one's cheating. But after that, each individual person then needs to get in a car and actually show that they can perform, driving the car successfully. That involves a rater being in the car with them, and that's an individual performance test. So, types of predictors. So again, just a quick review of validity. With each one of these predictors, just like with our measures of performance, we need to make sure that our predictors are being measured reliably. In other words, if a test is saying that someone has high cognitive ability, that same test administered a couple weeks later should give a similar score. And validity, that we're actually measuring what we think we're measuring. So the purpose of these predictors, again, is always to predict performance. So again, when we were talking about research methodology in industrial organizational psychology in one of the first lectures, I mentioned that when we talk about a true experiment, we often talk about independent variables, or IVs, and the dependent variable, or the outcome. When we're talking about I/O psychology, most often we're talking about predictors, which are the IVs, predicting performance, which is the DV. So whenever we're evaluating how useful a predictor is, not only do we want to make sure it's reliable and valid, we also want to make sure that it's related to performance. So a validity coefficient is a correlation that we conduct between the predictor and the criterion. So, for example, we want to determine what's the relationship between your score on a rules of the road test and your actual performance as a driver over the next year. That would be looking for the relationship of a validity coefficient. It's evidence that that test is an actual good performance of actual or predictor of actual performance. So now we're going to talk about just broadly the types of predictors that are commonly used in selection and I/O psychology. One of the biggest and most commonly used is cognitive ability test. It's the most frequently used predictor in selection, mainly because mental function or intelligence is an important part of most jobs. Another major reason for this is that the cognitive ability tests, they are somewhat controversial. People have made, and some strong arguments, are we actually measuring intelligence with a cognitive ability test? Are we actually getting at some kind of multidimensional measure of how smart someone is? And when you kind of think about this, you probably know people that are very smart in some areas, but not so smart in others. So, whenever we're measuring cognitive ability, we're not that sure exactly what we're capturing. In fact, a way this has been kind of addressed in I/O psychology is we often refer to general cognitive ability tests as simply G tests. So instead of saying intelligence or IQ or even cognitive ability, we'll just say we're measuring G. Well, what is G? G is something that's highly related to performance. In almost all jobs, we find that these ability tests, regardless of exactly what it is we're measuring, are one of the strongest predictors of performance on most jobs. And that's why we see them used the most in selection. Not only that, cognitive ability tests can usually be done as group, paper and pencil, power tests. So they're easy to give to a lot of people and be able to score very quickly. There's two general classes in selection of these types of tests. General cognitive ability. So in the big picture of knowledge, skills, and abilities, KSAs, this is really tests that are meant to be measuring the A part, your raw ability to adapt and understand information. But there's also specific cognitive ability tests, and these typically measure more of the K, the knowledge part of knowledge, skills, and abilities, as they're trying to actually access just what do you actually know about something. So general cognitive ability tests have a history, again, drawing from when I/O psychology was first called on in World War I and World War II to classify new recruits. In the United States, the original one was called the Army Alpha, followed by the Army Beta test, and evidence suggests that general cognitive ability accounts for a large portion of variance in performance. The validity coefficient, so the R, the correlation between across jobs between general cognitive ability and performance, is a 0.53. Now the effect size, in other words, how much variance of performance explained, is always that validity coefficient squared by itself. So 0.53 times 0.53, or an R squared of 0.25. That means that cognitive ability does explain about a quarter of all performance, but that also means that 75% of performance is not being explained by cognitive ability. So we definitely can do better. And when we're talking about coefficients, validity coefficients, in the rest of this lecture set, each time I'm going to be talking about it as if it is a unique predictor. So the validity coefficient of cognitive ability on performance is 0.53. If I later talk about the relationship between interviews and performance, and I give a validity coefficient, that again is if the only thing you're using to predict performance is that interview or is that other test. Incremental validity is a very important term here. Generally speaking, if we're trying to predict performance, in most cases we're going to start with a general cognitive ability test. They're the most supported, both through research but also legally, of being strongly related to job performance. And then the question is not how strong is each additional predictor by itself, but how much incremental or additional variance does it explain above and beyond cognitive ability. So no matter how you're predicting performance, whatever your first predictor is, beyond that, you're wanting to add additional predictors that actually add to the overall variance of performance explained. So we also find that general cognitive ability does tend to predict performance across multiple cultures, and an example, again, is the Wonderlic personality test. And there's quite a few different types of intelligence tests out there. Specific cognitive ability tests predict the likelihood that an individual will do well in a particular job given his or her specific knowledge and abilities. Validity coefficients here, again, if we're only using a specific cognitive ability test, range between an R of 0.4 and 0.5. So again, that ranges between about 16% of variance explained and 25% of variance explained. Examples include mechanical ability tests, comprehension of mechanical relations, recognition of tools. A lot of engineering jobs will have a specific mechanical ability test as a predictor. Spatial ability tests, so geographic relations, visualizing objects, rotating to form patterns. Again, you need to show that this is relevant to the job that you're selecting for, but if it is, it has a strong prediction. And finally, clerical ability tests, perceptual speed and accuracy, but you can also look at specific cognitive ability tests to basically capture almost any knowledge that you think is strongly related to job performance. Here's just a quick example of a couple of mechanical cognitive ability tests. So both tool recognition and also just general patterns or structures of engineering would be examples of this kind of a specific cognitive ability test. Another kind of ability test that we see in selection is emotional intelligence. And this typically, so when we're talking about cognitive ability and general cognitive ability tests and specific cognitive ability tests, we're generally focused on the level of trying to measure potential task performance. Emotional intelligence more maps on to contextual performance. So again, going back to the previous slides, task performance, there's usually specific tasks involved with the job. Contextual performance is more of your overall attitude and how you behave on the job to others. So emotional intelligence is the ability of individuals to generate, recognize, and express, and also understand and evaluate their own and others' emotions. It has been shown to lead to effectiveness in the workplace and also in people's personal lives. Recent research has shown that emotional intelligence, or EQ, may be an important predictor of work performance above and beyond other predictors. In other words, the advantage possibly here is this is an area of performance that's not necessarily being captured by other methods. There has been significant correlation between emotional intelligence and task performance in jobs that require a lot of social interaction. Again, ours there is 0.47. But it's not enough just to have high emotional intelligence. So you also have to be motivated to use it. And again, think back to our previous lecture on measuring performance. Campbell's taxonomy talks about that just knowing how to do something isn't enough. You need to also have the effort that you actually do those tasks or use that knowledge. Same with emotional intelligence. Someone with high emotional intelligence that's disengaged from the workforce is still not going to be a good performer. They need to have high intelligence and motivated to use it. Another type of test that we can use is psychomotor tests, so measuring the sensory abilities and evaluate speed and accuracy of motor and sensory coordination. An example is pictured here, the Purdue pegboard. Basically, it is a speed test where you're having to do a very monotonous set of tasks, but the idea is you're putting pegs in a board and then pulling them out and seeing how many you can do in a very short period of time with no actual errors. So again, this shows hand-eye coordination, and some jobs require hand-eye coordination, and this would be a good predictor for it. Again, going back to the example of a driving test, when you go in to get your driver's license, when you're given a vision test and a hearing test, those are psychomotor tests. So the validity, again, is fairly high when used in isolation, 0.4 to 0.53, but again, it depends on the type of job. So if you give someone a hearing test for a job that involves no hearing whatsoever as far as their performance, there's going to be no relationship between these two. So therefore, these are not suitable for all jobs. Personality tests have become more and more popular in organizational selection. And again, it's not because a personality test by itself is a good predictor of performance. It's that especially for somewhat more complex jobs, and again, jobs that involve social interaction, personality often provides incremental validity above and beyond other types of tests. So personality are individual traits or predispositions to behave in a particular way across situations. And again, just like cognitive ability is a good predictor of task performance, and a lot of times cognitive ability is going to be used to basically predict tasks that have been found by a job analysis that are job relevant, personality tests are more often tied to basically the idea of contextual performance through competency modeling. So in other words, what type of person tends to perform well in this particular organization across multiple different types of jobs? And personality has been found to be somewhat predictive of behavior across multiple situations. About 40% of Fortune 100 companies use these in some way in screening applications, and honestly, that is increasing. More and more organizations are adding personality measures to their selection techniques. Typically, it's self-report, so it's often a power test. You're given enough time to complete it. It's usually pen and paper, so you can do it online or basically filling out forms, self-report. And often it is a group test that you can take with large groups of people. You don't need an individual administering the personality test. Some examples are the NEO, the 16 personality factor questionnaire, and the Hogan inventories, and there's a lot more out there. Most of these, in some way, measure the big five. Now, each one may measure in a couple additional traits or rename these traits, but we find across all these personality tests this idea that there's 5 broad categories of personality. Openness to experience, so how willing you are to try new things and to be exposed to new cultures and new ideas. Conscientiousness, how focused you are on detail and doing things by the book and the right way. Extroversion, so how outgoing or personable you are. Agreeableness, so how nice you are, how pleasant you are, how agreeable you are in conversations. And finally, neuroticism or emotional stability, so kind of your emotional state. Are you fairly stoic in how you react to things, or are you very emotional in how you react to things? Personality measures have been found to be valid predictors of job performance, but notice that R is down a lot smaller than what we have been talking to, about 0.23. Some say this is an underestimate because personality dimensions are tried to use to predict specific behavior. So remember, personality is expected to predict performance across multiple situations. So when we're trying to predict someone's performance or any behavior based on their personality, personality is often not a great predictor of individual, in-the-moment performance. So for example, if you're extremely extroverted, if you're in a class, you're probably still going to sit there quietly and listen, even though you're extremely extroverted, because the situation tells you what you should do. Well, jobs also are fairly strong situations that often kind of tamp down personality influences. Generally speaking, also, we found across the board the 2 biggest predictors of most jobs is conscientiousness and emotional stability. The problem with personality tests and using them in selection is they are susceptible to faking. It does require someone to have the ability to fake, so their ability to actually process what the questions in the personality test are trying to assess. But you also have to be motivated to fake. So motivation to faking is influenced by demographic characteristics, individual differences, and perceptual variables. What this means is that whether you fake or not is influenced by your belief in whether you'll be caught faking. It is based on some gender differences and other demographic differences. So some people are more likely, some groups are more likely to fake than others. Individual differences, so very conscientious people are less likely to fake. People that are very low in conscientiousness are more likely to fake. And also how you perceive what the actual test is being used for. So if you perceive a test as being just an honest measure of your personality, you're less likely to fake. If you recognize that the personality test is trying to find a good fit for a job that you want, you're probably more likely to fake. There's been a fair amount of debate about the effectiveness of faking on the validity coefficients of non-cognitive tests. In other words, when there isn't a right answer, it's just answers about how you behave in the workplace. Generally, experts do agree across all this debate that faking does occur, it is fairly frequent, and it has at least the potential to be problematic. Generally, we find that what happens is most people on average fake at about the same level, which means that if you had an honest measure of conscientiousness, you'd probably find people rating between the low on a 1-point scale. Some people would be at a 1, some people would be at a 2, a lot of people would be at a 3, a few people would be at a 4, and very few people would be at a 5. If everyone fakes, basically all that happens is the distribution just shifts towards the positive. Now your very lowest conscientious people are listing themselves as 2s. Few people are listing themselves as 3s. A lot of people are listing themselves as 4s. And a fair amount of people are listing them as 5s. That still means that if you select the people with 5s, you're probably still getting the people that are more conscientious generally. An effort to find out about faking or to adjust for faking is another type of intelligence or selection test, and that's actually the integrity test. Integrity tests attempt to predict whether an employee will engage in counterproductive or dishonest work behaviors, including cheating, sabotaging, and stealing, and also integrity tests are sometimes included in selection to try to determine if someone's likely to be cheating on the rest of the test. There's two types. The first one is an overt integrity test. It literally looks like it's measuring integrity. It involves questions of a lot of morally ambiguous situations about small theft and small theft behaviors. Again, it's self-report. Now, often there's faking on the test that's meant to determine if you're going to cheat. But much like with personality tests, this usually involves you still find that there's a shift in the distribution, but the people with the lowest integrity still tend to score the lowest, even though they've adjusted their score up, and the people that are high in integrity tend to score at the very top of the scale. Another type of integrity test is a personality type integrity test. It basically measures personality characteristics that have been found in the past to be predictive of counterproductive behavior, to say that if you have that personality type, you likely also have lower integrity. There is clear empirical support. It does appear to be a valid predictor for counterproductive behavior. So when we give people integrity tests and then see if it's related, in other words, low integrity is related to high counterproductive behaviors, we find a relationship, and that people with high integrity tend to perform better at the jobs, and we find an R of 0.34. Again, faking also appears to be possible on some integrity tests, and there has not been a whole lot of research on integrity tests in other cultures. That's mainly focused in the U.S. And one of the primary reasons that also have driven the use of integrity tests in selection is the fact that U.S. selection law has basically made it to where other forms of measuring truthfulness, like a lie detector test, is not a legally valid way to select. The only time that you can use something like an actual lie detector test is for national security type jobs.